Welcome to TechNation's on-demand webinar series. Our webinars are focused specifically on the biomedical and HTM industry to provide you with easily accessible educational opportunities. New webinars are added on a regular basis, and each will be eligible for one continuing education credit from the ACI. At the conclusion of this presentation, you'll be able to access a link that will take you to a quick survey. You will be able to download your certificate once you submit the survey. Today's presentation is titled, How to Get the Staffing You Need to Succeed, and will be presented by Alan Gresh, VP of Healthcare Strategy of Accruent, and Michael Heiser, Manager of Clinical Engineering of Middlesex Health. We would like to thank our sponsor, Accruent. Accruent is the world's leading provider of intelligent solutions for the built environment and continues to set new expectations for how organizations can use data to manage their facilities and assets. With office locations across the globe, Accruent serves more than 10,000 customers in more than 150 countries. For more information, please visit accruent.com. As I mentioned earlier, our presenters are Al Gresh and Michael Heiser. Al and Michael will show participants exactly what needs to be done to remedy staffing shortages with real-life case studies that have proven to be successful in multiple organizations. Al, you may begin whenever you are ready.
Hi, and welcome to today's webinar, How to Get the Staffing You Need to Succeed. I am Al Gresh, the Vice President of Healthcare Strategy at Accruent, leading provider of healthcare physical resource management solutions. Prior to joining Accruent, I was Executive Vice President of Capital Technology Management at AlphaSource, and before that held similar roles at TriMedics Healthcare Technology Management and Alexian Brothers Health System. Much of my experience and reputation in the industry came from building and leading one of the nation's premier clinical engineering programs at Aurora Healthcare, a 15-hospital system headquartered in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I published the 8th edition of AMU's Healthcare Technology Management Manual in 2019 and was a past chair and am still a current member of AMU's Healthcare Technology Leadership Committee. With me today is Michael Heiser. Mike is a certified clinical engineer and a certified healthcare technology manager. He's currently the manager of clinical engineering at Middlesex Health. He started as an intern in clinical engineering in 2012 while pursuing his master's degree. Over the past 9 years, he has leveraged the data in their CMMS system to drive improvement opportunities within the department and has worked collaboratively with clinical staff on numerous major medical device replacements by performing device analysis and project management. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you.
So let's jump in here. I'll get things started for us. Our agenda for today is I'm going to start by doing an overview of the barriers to getting additional staffing. It's important to understand these barriers so that you know what tactics to use to overcome those barriers. So some of those are healthcare finance perceptions, and we'll talk about what some of those are. The typical productivity models that are used in support departments such as ours. We'll talk about some old school benchmarking that exists. I will tell you that I've had some experience with some of those from a variety of different consulting organizations. And then we'll move on to talk about a better productivity model than the one that's typically used, and whether or not you choose to employ that productivity model, using the tactics and methodologies within that will allow you to do true benchmarking within your organization, and hopefully you'll see the value that comes from that. We'll move on to talk about the data that's needed in order to make these justifications. First and foremost, you need an accurate inventory, and you know that just sort of goes without saying. Yes, of course, we need an accurate inventory. That's one of the major expectations of surveyors when they come in, is that we have that. But I will tell you that in the course of my travels, I've done some consulting with a number of different healthcare organizations, and in some that I've been in, I've found as many as 15 ports of entry for equipment to come into the organization. Many of those 15 that did not find their way to clinical engineering or HTM for inventory and scheduling of PMs. So there's a huge risk that's involved in that. So I don't want to assume that everyone has an accurate inventory. So if you don't have 100% confidence that that's the case, I suggest that you meet with your supply chain and materials management or receiving folks to make sure that that does happen. We'll be talking about device hours needed by modality, and I'll cover that in pretty good detail. We'll talk about annual device hours per technician, and you'll see how that comes into play and why you need that information. And you'll also need the costs to outsource services for the equipment that was brought on in the previous year. And Michael will be sharing some firsthand examples of that. And then I'll cover how to make your case. I'll show you the process that I used. Michael will also share with you the process that he used in a recent case study. And when I say recent, I mean very, very recent. Michael actually sat down with his finance group about a week ago and actually did get approval for the staffing that he required. So again, very, very recent and very relevant to our discussion today. All right, so let's start talking about those barriers. Healthcare finance perceptions. I've always found it very interesting, the perception that finance leaders have, especially around inventory. The assumption that I've run into many times is that for every new piece of equipment that is brought into the organization, the same number of devices have been retired. That is an incorrect assumption. I can tell you from firsthand experience, in the organizations that I worked in, we averaged 10% growth in inventory year over year. And so not only is that a fallacy, but that perception lends to the thought that because it's a net zero or zero sum thing, that your costs shouldn't go up either. So they're going to want to keep your budget flat as well. And that's just an unrealistic expectation. And so it's important for you to help your finance people understand the reality of what you're facing around inventory growth, but also the cost to support that inventory. Again, I think it's an unreasonable expectation that your costs are going to stay flat if you continue to grow your inventory. And I will tell you that I made a very direct statement to my finance leaders over the years that if you want my budget to stay flat year over year, stop buying new stuff. And then I have a chance to do that. The second perception is efficiency. And this might sound a little bit harsh, but the assumption here by most finance folks is that you won't do anything to increase efficiency unless I make you do that. So what I mean by that is if I deny additional resources, whether financial or human resources, it will force you to figure out how to do more with less, okay? So if you understand that as a barrier, then you'll be able to figure out ways to overcome that and show that your finance people that you are effectively working on increasing efficiencies without them having to force you to do that. But again, you have to prove that out. So let's talk for a moment about the typical productivity model. You'll see here that I have displayed the fixed productivity model, and most every HTM department that I've spoken to or worked with has been on this fixed productivity model. And I will tell you that before we changed it, we were also on a fixed productivity model. And essentially what that is your budgeted hours divided by actual worked hours times 100 to give you a percent productivity. So let's run through an example of that. So let's say I have 5 technicians, and each of them is budgeted for a 40-hour work week. Okay, so 5 times 40 equals 200, and they actually worked, each of the 5 of them actually worked 40 hours, so you end up with 200 over 200 times 100 equals 100% productivity. Great. But if you work any overtime, then that increases the actual worked hours and decreases your productivity. So about the only thing that this model does is to help put a cap on overtime. And okay, that may seem like a good thing, but what if your team is putting in overtime to do some work that you would otherwise have to outsource to a vendor? Okay, so you're actually saving the organization money, but you're being penalized for it. The other thing about this is that if you're denied additional resources, then you have no choice but to put in overtime to get the work done that needs to get done, because we all know you have to achieve a certain level of PM completion every month. And if you put in that overtime, once again, you're being penalized, and it becomes a vicious cycle. And the other part of this is that, so let's say one of your guys takes a week vacation, right? So you've got the budgeted hours of 40 times the 5 is 200, but now you're 4 times 40 for the actual, which translates to 160, which gives you a productivity number of 125%. Think about that. You are most productive when you're not working at all. How is that even possible? How is that even a measure of productivity? So we'll go on to talk about a better model for that in the next slides. Old school benchmarking, as I said, I've had experience with a number of different consulting firms, and some of them will come in and tell your organization how many people you should have in your department based on bed count. And that's all well and good, except that if you are an academic medical center or a high acuity hospital, you have a higher density of devices per bed, and so that may not be relevant. Square footage is another one that's often used and more prevalent in the facilities engineering realm. But again, it's not relevant to what you do, because the work that you do is based entirely on the inventory that you have to support. And so there is one here that's on inventory, but again, what plays into that relative to variables is how much of that inventory is on service contract versus the work that you're completing yourself in-house. I think anybody would quickly recognize that the amount of time that it takes to manage service on a group of modalities is much less than the amount of time that it would take to actually service those modalities. And so, again, if you recognize those barriers, you'll be able to much more readily come up with ways to overcome those barriers. So let's move on and talk about the better productivity model. So I shared with you before that the typical is just worked hours versus, or budgeted hours versus worked hours, and we talked about the shortcomings of that. And the model that we developed. We worked with our operations improvement group, and I guarantee you every healthcare system has one. This is the model that we came up with, was to take actual device hours, and I'll get into more detail on what that translates to, but this is the time that you're spending actually working on equipment, divided by actual payroll hours, times the average payroll hours divided by the average device hours, times 100, will come up with the productivity percent. And again, I'll move on to talk about this actual calculation in greater detail. But you can see that in 2005 on this chart was on the old fixed model, and in every subsequent year, 2006 through 2009, we were on this new productivity model, and you can see that every year we were above 100% productivity. Why is that important? What we're here to talk about today is how to justify additional staffing. I can almost guarantee you that you will not get approval for additional staffing if you're below 100% productivity, because your executive leadership is going to expect that you've got some room there to be more efficient and increase your productivity that will allow you to absorb the additional workloads that you have. So first and foremost, that is the most important thing for you to establish, is that you are at an acceptable level of productivity, or again, I guarantee you won't get any additional staffing approved. Here's the thing about this model. You have to have good data integrity. And often when people think about data integrity, it's related to things like, a consistent manufacturer listing, a model listing, device category listing, and you've got consistency around those things in your database. But it extends well beyond that. It's having a clean and concise set of codes with definitions that every one of your technicians has an awareness of, so everybody's documenting things the same way. And with that, it's making sure that your people are documenting everything that they do, everything that they do. And I know a lot of organizations struggle with that, but it's critically important for you to get the staffing you need for your folks to do that. And I will tell you that in my past, I had some crucial conversations with certain individuals who made arguments like, well, what do you want me to do, take care of my customer or do my paperwork? And my response to that was, well, I need you to do both, okay? And I guess I'll make this as clear as I possibly can, that in this organization, it's a condition of employment, right? Life's about choices, and if you choose to not do your documentation, then essentially you're choosing to not work here. And for some of these folks, especially the ones that are working on high-end modalities, I challenge them with, name a single company that you could go to work for that would allow you to not document the work that you do. I can't think of a single one. So I did want to spend some time calling this out as a criticality of making this work.
And Al, if I could, from a standpoint of documenting hours, it's always difficult to do that and have that conversation with the technicians, but I think it's imperative to describe to them the importance of documenting those hours to get you the help that you need, because it's not just helping you and managing the department, but it's helping them in not being overwhelmed with the workload as additional devices get added to the inventory, because if the staffing doesn't change, then they're going to feel that pressure.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you jumping in there, Michael, because you're absolutely right. Everyone wants to know what's in it for them, and as you called out, Mike, the thing that's in it for them is if you want me to work at getting you additional help, I need your help. help me help you kind of a thing, right? So if you don't do your documentation consistently and accurately, I can't do that. I have no tools. My chamber is empty without that information. So thank you for adding that. And Mike, please feel free to jump in anytime throughout this part of the presentation if you've got additional flavor to add. That was helpful. So let's talk about device hours versus non-device hours. And with the productivity model that I talked about, this is critically important. And I would say even without that productivity model, I would argue that it is very, very important for you to discern what time your technicians are spending on actual device activities versus non-device hours. And so device hours are made up of things like planned maintenance, corrective maintenance, incoming inspections, incident investigations, hazard alerts, and recalls, where non-device hours are things like department meetings, compliance training, vendor training, administrative work. And that administrative work bullet is something that is huge in some organizations. Travel time projects is one I left off this list, but another one that is potentially not directly related to supporting devices in your inventory, but other work that has to be done. But I would ask anyone, if you looked at this list and you had to point to the things that you're actually paying your staff to do, which would it be? Clearly, it's the device hours stuff, right? It's all important, but those are the things that are most important for them to focus on. And if you have an idea of how your staff is spending their time, then you can find ways to improve on that, and I'll show you some examples of that. I often liken it to creating a household budget, right? You simply document everything that you're spending money on, and once you have that, you can evaluate and analyze that to see if those are the things that you actually want to spend money on, or if there's a better way to improve your financial position. And it's no different here. So we went through this process, and year one, the average device hours per technician was 1,001. And the non-device hours were 859. Now, I will tell you that this is this is the average in the industry, okay? The average in the industry is 1,000 device hours per technician. Now, think about that for a minute. Less than half of the time of an FTE is spent doing the things that you actually hired them to do. So you should work on maximizing that in any way that you possibly can. So going back to the productivity calculation, use a percent of documented device hours to total documented hours to determine what represents 100% productivity for a given time frame. All right, so I have an example here. In year one, again, using those numbers of 1,001 device hours divided by the total documented time, which was 1,001 plus the 859 for non-device hours. And this was in 2006 is when we were at this, or 2005 where we had this. And so what that translates to, in order to determine what constitutes 100% productivity in a 40-hour work week, if you apply that 53.82% to 40 hours, if you document 21.53 device hours and 18.47 non-device hours, you'll be at 100% productivity. And where the advantage of this model comes in is if you work overtime, total hours goes up. And hopefully your device hours goes up as well. Hopefully no one's paying people overtime to do any of the non-device hour work. Similarly, PTO, if somebody's on PTO, the device hours goes down, but also the total hours goes down. If you document more than 21.53 device hours, your productivity goes above 100%. If you document less than 21.53 device hours, your productivity drops below 100%. So as I indicated, we ran this past our operations improvement folks, and we trialed it for a couple of months. And all we did with this was we provided them the documentation hours, or the documented hours from our CMMS. They then calculated our productivity. And after a couple of months, they said, well, okay, this seems to work. Let's keep going with it. And eventually, they fully endorsed it, and it was something that we went forward with. Now, here I talk about the first year being 1,001 device hours and 859 non-device hours. Every year, we refreshed that and did this calculation to come up with a new baseline for what represents 100% productivity. And here I show that trend. And again, if you think about what productivity should reflect, because I have gotten pushback from some people that said, well, that's not really a measure of productivity. But the productivity comes from manufacturing, and it's producing a certain amount of work in a given period of time. And again, going back to the idea that the most important work that these folks do is working on equipment, fixing the customer. Don't you want to maximize that time? And if you've got the ability to measure that in a comprehensive manner, you can do exactly that. So here it shows that in 2006, we started this. We were at 1,001 annual device hours per technician, and then year 2 it went up to 1,278. Year 3, 1,330. Year 4, 1,399. I left Aurora in 2011, and at that time we were at 1,550 annual device hours per technician. So think about how much additional work you can get done at 1,550 annual device hours per technician versus 1,000. And then you can readily understand why this is something that the finance and operations improvement embraced so well. I'm just using the numbers here too. What I want to call out is that increase from 1,001 to 1,399 that represented an increase in 33,830 device hours, which is huge because I had 85 technicians at the time. So again, this is something that I think will help you get better as an organization and become more efficient. And again, if you can share that information with your finance people, it'll definitely be a benefit. So let's move on to talk about the data that you're going to need. As I said, the accurate inventory is not always a good assumption that you've got that. So if you don't have an accurate inventory count, you're going to struggle to come up with an accurate amount of time that you're going to need to support your inventory, because some of it you don't even know is there. Device hours per modality, annual device hours per technician, and then the cost to outsource. So this chart was a Manning study that we did, or it was a table that we kept for every single device category in our inventory. So I know it's a bit of an eye chart here, but you can see, like, for aerator, air cleaner, alarm, a variety of different analyzers, and this goes on to cover every single device category in our inventory. We had a listing of the number of devices that were in our active inventory, but here's the key part of it, were the hours per device that it took to maintain that in both planned maintenance and corrective maintenance. And so again, this goes back to the importance of having your staff document everything that they do, because without that information, you can't collect this. And you'll see as I move on here and go through what we presented to finance, where that becomes a critical factor. And then just carried out where we just multiplied the number of devices in the active inventory by the time that it took to support it to come up with the total number of device hours needed. I talked a little bit ago about having a clean, standardized and concise list of codes in your CMMS. And what I'm showing here is the request codes that we had, and as you can see, a very, very concise list, each with a clear definition of what that represents. That's critical if you want your staff to do things the same way, that that you have something like this that directs them to what each thing means, and without that, good luck getting them to document things the same way. When I first started this initiative, I had over 150 codes in our database, and what that created was the likelihood that if I had 20 different technicians doing exactly the same work, they were likely documenting it or coding it 20 different ways, and that just was not something that we could let continue. So we did put in a lot of work to clean this up. Here's another one that shows the result codes. So we can see for each request code, we had a finite list of acceptable result codes, again, with clear definitions. In addition to this, you can see here the fault codes. For each request code, there was a finite list of fault codes that could be entered into the CMMS with clear definitions. So again, having something like this in place is critical to have your staff document things the same way. You may be aware of an initiative that Amy is sponsoring called the CMMS Collaborative, where Accruent and all of the other CMMS vendors in the industry are working collaboratively to come up with a standardized list of codes that we would recommend as a default set of codes when we do a new implementation. And I think that's going to help. It's been one of the major obstacles to doing meaningful benchmarking in our industry. So, I think this will help. And then, going back to the request codes, you need to determine which of those request codes you're going to include in your device hours calculation. And, in one of the earlier slides, I provided a list of what we used, but you need to make that determination of what makes sense in your organization. All right, so let's talk about how to make your case, and then you'll see how all of this information that we talked about up until this point comes into play. So this was the analysis that I presented to finance every year at budget time. And you can see in big letters there, productivity. I started these out by making sure that they understood that we were above 100% productivity, because you establish right out of the gate that I can't absorb any additional work. And that sort of sets the table for moving on and talking about the ads. So You'll see here there's a list of or a column of different modalities, and at the time that this was created, I had my business broken out into 4 different modality groupings: general biomed, biomed specialty. So biomed specialties was anything that would typically be outsourced, things like anesthesia machines, ventilators, sterilizers, lights, and then imaging group 1 were things like CT, MRI, and general rad, RNF. And then imaging group 2 were things like mammo machines, linear accelerators, nuke medicine or gamma cameras. Ultrasound was in that group. So why we did that is because first of all, there's a different cost to the people that you hire into those roles or into those groups, but also, and I'll show you a KPI report that I maintain that shows you the difference in devices per technician within those different categories. And then along with that, like I said, we were a 15 hospital system, and our business was divided out into different regions. So we had, you can see 5 different regions: Metro, Central, Kettle Moraine, North, and South. And our department was a corporate department that all rolled up into a single budget, but then we had allocations that we sent back to each of the different regions. And so what this allowed us to do is easily break out what the needs were in each of the different regions. So then what we did with this is we took our baseline and we subtracted from that baseline all of the devices that had been retired in the previous year. And then we added back into that all of the new devices that were added to the inventory. And that gave us this net adds. And that's represented in 2 different ways. The first is the count, so how many devices total does that represent? And then because going back to that chart or that table where we had the amount of hours required to support each device type, translated into the hours per year that were needed. And so, we applied that to every single region, and then at the end came up with the total required for that year. So here you can see we had an additional 6,500 and change in additional hours required to support that added inventory. And then, I'll talk a little bit about how we came to identify the number of FTEs associated with that. But I think what's key here is, again, going back to this productivity number. So you establish that you can't absorb that. So there's one of 2 ways that you can accommodate that additional inventory. One is to have them give you the people that you need to support it in-house. The second is to outsource that work to an outside organization. And typically that's at about a 40% premium over what it would cost you to support it. But I think it's important to have those actual numbers that you can show your finance people. And when we get to Michael's section of this, he will show you the analysis that he did, where he actually did show the amount of dollars that would have been required to outsource that. And I did have that information that I presented. And with all of this stuff, again, this was a very concise summary, because that's typically how executives like to see things, but I had the detail behind any of this if it was asked for. So again, I talked about how we went about calculating the number of FTEs that we needed based on the total hours per year, and that drops down then to that middle section of numbers. So again, broken out by modality, what were the total numbers added, and then at this particular point in time, we were at 1,230.25 annual device hours per technician or per FTE. If you use 2,080 as your divisor to make this calculation, you are cheating yourself immensely. And that's another reason why it's so important to determine how much of your staff's time is spent actually turning wrenches or working on equipment or taking care of equipment or taking care of the customer. Because again, it's about half the time that it's actually spent, and so that's the number that you want to use to determine your total FTEs. And so here we were at 5.32 FTEs that were needed. Now here is where I generated a ton of credibility with my finance folks. I would get to this point in the presentation and represent that according to these calculations, I needed an additional 5.32 FTEs. But then I went on to say that if we had continued to do things the same way that we did last year, I would have needed 5.32 FTEs. However, we've implemented some improved processes that increased our efficiency that took it up to, I think the following year was 1,330 annual device hours. So if I recalculate this using that 1,330, I don't need 5.32. I only need whatever that calculation would come to. And like I said, you wouldn't believe the amount of credibility that earned with our finance folks. I will tell you though that an additional discussion that I had with them was, look, I know how this works. I've been doing this long enough that when you come with your reduction in force initiative 6 months from now, I want acknowledgement that I gave at the office, okay? Because what I could do here is I could just go with the 5.32, and when you come with that, now I'll have the ability to give up a body and still get the work done that I need to get done. But you know what? I'm dealing with people's lives here, right? The last thing in the world I want to do is hire a person and 6 months down the road lay him off, right? I don't want to do that. So I want acknowledgement that I'm proactive about giving that up ahead of time. And by the way, I did ask for that acknowledgement in writing, and had to pull it out on occasion. And then the last part of this was to show the inventory growth, and this year was a bit below what the average was, 7.22%. But again, it was important to show them that our inventory didn't stay flat, that we had growth there. And just, I will tell you that as long as I had been using that model, never did I get denied the staff that I needed, because I had the data to support those requests. And what I'm showing you here is just, this was a KPI chart that I kept, and there's a lot of information here. I know it's just also a bit of an eye chart, but I wanted to call out cost savings, and this is month by month. The number of devices per technician. I wanted to call out the downtime associated with each of our major modalities, because these are the things that executive leadership really cares about. But the two things that I want to really point to here are productivity, number one, to make sure that we were maintaining productivity month over month, but then also response time. So when you're talking to them about the advantages of giving you the people that you need versus outsourcing it, this should come into play as well, where our response time to calls was much, much less than if we called in a vendor. And so part of the argument was I can provide as good or better service, and I can do it much faster, and I can do it cheaper. So which would you like me to do? So lastly, I'm going to pass the baton to Michael to talk about what he did recently at Middlesex. So Mike?
Thanks, Al. I appreciate it. So at Middlesex, we identified a bit of a challenge that I'm sure everyone is going through right now. The onset of COVID brought quite a bit of unexpected purchases. In addition to, we did have the regular growth that Al spoke of to our inventory, just the same, where just every year we've been growing little by little. And then you couple COVID on top with the massive amount of purchases we had to make for different forms of equipment that were necessary. And it was necessary to get them in fast. Now it's coming time, though, we're going on a year of having them, and the maintenance is coming due, and it becomes a bit of an issue trying to keep up with everything that's grown on us, essentially. So one of the things that we did many years ago was exactly as Al mentioned before. We talked to the technicians about time documentation and explained why it is imperative that we document our time as much as possible, nearly 100% of our paid hours. And we tried to limit the codes so that we can easily isolate down where that time is being spent. So we created some ideal standards that we wanted to get close to for our device hours, which would be preventive maintenance, the equipment search time associated with that, and the corrective maintenance was essentially 60% of the time is what we ideally wanted to see. The PTO time, we asked them to document when they are not here so that we can capture that in the database and in an all-encompassing report. Unrecorded, based on kind of industry rule of thumb, the expectation is that the best documentation that you can get out of anyone is around 85%, but we want to try to push them to do better. And then we have all these other categories where it's projects or random incomings that have to be done, just standard inventory practices, or travel to get to some of our remote sites. That's very real time. So based on our most recent information that we were able to pull out of the database, we were coming close to many of our expected ideals. Equipment search time, we've found that we've been spending nearly 6% of our time actually searching for equipment due for PM. And a lot of this is in relation to RTLS and the functionality that we currently have, as well as COVID, making it more and more difficult to locate equipment. And then we actually do better than our ideal for unrecorded time, which is great. But you could see that we're spending more time doing incomings and inventory as well. Again, a lot of this is based off of what we saw with COVID because of the sheer amount of equipment that was coming in, from just one-off thermometers to ventilators. So we took all of the devices that we added that were net new since 2019. So as Al mentioned, that there's this misconception that you're buying devices to replace existing devices, but that's not always the case. So we were buying some devices to add to our fleets. Infusion pumps, for example, was, clearly there was a great need during COVID. Laryngoscopes, video laryngoscopes. We actually absorbed bed maintenance into our clinical engineering department. So that was something that we weren't servicing before, but we absorbed that activity. So when you look at that cost to either have an OEM perform it, which of course there's the baked in cost of parts associated with that, so it's not a one-for-one when you're talking staffing, but there is cost associated with that. And then there's some things that just an OEM won't provide service for. For example, the temporal thermometers. That's not an OEM contract, but we bought so many of them that it does add quite a bit of time throughout the year to service them. So there are supplemental service providers out there that you can hire a temporary VMAT to come in and help with essentially when there's a rush of maintenance that needs to be done. But that comes at a high cost. So when you tally everything up and you look at what our average historical annual hours, that is our time of maintaining these exact types of devices over many years, that's our average. You're talking about over a full FTE's worth of time. And that's not just the FTE's ability to maintain the equipment time. And when you compare it to the cost, it's almost a no-brainer. Now, we did also wanted to compare ourselves against the industry, and there are tools out there that exist that allow you to be able to pull these inventories and look at other hospitals or other groups that have that exact same device that you have, and how are they maintaining it? What is their average hours in terms of performing the correctives and the preventative maintenance, so that you can help benchmark yourself on that level and see how effective you are. And we like to compare that because not everything has data, but we are running very close to the same as the average for the industry. Some things were better, some things we have opportunities for improvement. But in the end, it's still a substantial net add of hours. So when you look at this and you look at our maintenance capacity, which we defined as 55% of an FTE's time to 60% to create these thresholds, over time since 2019, as we were adding equipment and hit that that bolus of equipment that came in with COVID, we started to pass this 60% threshold, and we're starting to see overtime kick in. We're starting to see a substantial number of work orders that are taking longer to attend to, or staff that are being overwhelmed with just work that we can't get to because it's either in use or it's being used on patients rightfully for COVID purposes, or we can't find it because we're having to try to follow COVID protocols, avoiding certain rooms because we don't want to be gowning in and out of these rooms. So it makes things extremely difficult when the inventory is also growing. It creates this perfect storm. So we looked and we used the tool that we have to forecast what is the predicted maintenance needs based off of our inventory that we have of known devices that we are servicing. What does the industry expect from an average across everybody out there that has these devices? What should we be looking at maintaining? And that's that green line there. And we are not even meeting that standard, which means we do not have enough hours from our current staff to actually meet what we would expect from a benchmark out there in the marketplace of these devices. So that's very important to help tell that story of, in order to move these thresholds higher, we either become more efficient, which we're already better than what the, average in the industry that Al had mentioned earlier, where it's less than 50% of their time. There's only so much efficiency that we can gain. So we're at a tipping point where we need to add staff. And then futuristically, when it comes to this challenge, the analysis that we're performing or that we performed was retroactive, or reactive, I should say. It's addressing the problem when there is one, but we want to be more proactive in that. So one of the things that we're going to be doing going forward is every time that we're looking at absorbing these new service lines, whether it's buying new devices and adding to the fleet, or taking something off of contract and doing that cost analysis, let's determine how is this impacting our maintenance capacity. So for example, if we bought 10 defibrillators and our current annual maintenance capacity allows for 400 additional hours every year, and the expected annual maintenance capacity growth from adding these devices and doing them in-house is 80 hours, then we'll have 320 hours remaining, meaning we can safely absorb this activity, but we are coming closer and closer to reaching a tipping point. So when you look at the expected cost to service ratio of doing it in-house, it's 6% at, say, $20,000, but the expected lowest cost to service ratio for the lowest contract